Hello, international church members. It's very nice to see you, but at the same time, it's unfortunate that we have to see you online. The title of today's sermon is The Temptation of Power. The passage today is 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 to 9. Let's read the verses together and share the sermon. Verse 1. Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to Saul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war. And it was pleasing in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The women sang as they played, and said, Saul had slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Today's sermon mainly focuses on power. For starters, what is power? The dictionary definition of power is the ability to act or have influence over others. Does this word to you have a negative connotation or a positive one? It could be both. For example, when it comes to COVID-19 outbreak, countries that had power over information succeeded in having control of COVID-19 cases. We have to leave our cell phone numbers and our addresses wherever we visit, and we have to measure our body temperature wherever we go, which all of these have become a new norm. However, some scholars are concerned that excessively having control of people's personal information can lead to giving birth to a big brother. Big brother, according to the dictionary, refers to an organization or a social system that exercises control over the society by monopolizing information. So power is something that can be exerted with good purpose, which leads to saving people, whereas it can be abused if it's used in a selfish way. In other words, power becomes a temptation when one attempts to use it in his or her interest. In this case, power no longer protects people, it rather monitors and regulates people. In today's passage, there's a person who fell into temptation of power. That is Saul. After the times of Judges, Israelites called for a king. God first warned them that in the long term, having a king would be disadvantageous for the Israelites themselves, because their children will have to be the soldiers, cooks, and the servants of the king. But the Israelites still wanted a king, and therefore Saul became their first king. Saul was at the center of the power in Israel. In the meantime, there was a young man named David who was very courageous and faithful. David gained trust from his soldiers and from Saul's servants as well, and people started to look up to him. One day, when David returned from killing Philistine, women in the city came out to the streets and started dancing and singing. But the lyrics said that Saul killed thousands of people while David killed 10,000s. And this was the point where Saul lost his temper. He was threatened that David might one day take over his kingdom. Verses 8 to 9 shows that Saul was already tempted by power and was firmly holding on to the power and the authority that he had. One important takeaway from this message is that we see allies as enemies when we are tempted by power, like Saul did. Then a question comes up. Is power something that leads us to evil? No. Let's find out where power came from in the first place. When God created the world, he made Adam and Eve on the sixth day. God gave all the control to Adam and Eve to rule over all the creatures on earth. The power that first humans had was delegated by God. The purpose of power was to control and rule over God's kingdom. There's a good example where power was exercised well, fulfilling God's purpose. It's Joseph. Joseph was able to become the prime minister of Egypt because he translated the Pharaoh's dream that there will be 7 years of harvest and another 7 years of famine. Starting from the beginning, he gained power with the help of God. When Joseph became the prime minister, he diligently prepared for the next 14 years of good harvest and famine by storing crops for 7 years of harvest and releasing them in the famine. Here we need to realize that we are not in charge of our power. The power we have is delegated by God. One way to overcome the temptation of power is to recognize that we are the stewards of power that God delegated. The world today tells us to be wary of friends and have suspicion against our closest ones because you never know when your closest ones will turn their back on you. This is the law of power in the world. Going back to today's passage, however, there's a person who acted totally opposite of the worldly law of power and Saul. It was Saul's son, Jonathan. In today's passage, Jonathan gives his power to David instead of protecting himself by bullying him. He makes a covenant with David and gives him a piece of his robe and his armor. He intuitively knew that David was an extraordinary man who would prosper in the future. Even though Saul curses and punishes Jonathan for having a good relationship with David, Jonathan does not give up and gives David all the things that reveals his power. Here we must remember that the way to overcome the temptation of power is to admit the authority of God, like Jonathan did. And lastly, remember Jesus Christ, who came to this earth and obeyed God no matter what by ending up being crucified on the cross. We can win over temptation if we obey God and accept His authority. Let me wrap up today's sermon. First of all, power is what God delegated to us to look over His kingdom. We must always remember that we are not in charge of our power, and the only way to overcome the temptation of power is to obey God and admit His authority, like Joseph, Jonathan, and Jesus Christ did. Thank you and have a safe week.